Hi guys, my name is Juan Aquino, and I'm going to be talking about practice structures, instruction, and feedback for my case study. So before I get into some of the details of my case study, I just want to start by saying that this case study is based off of a true experience. I just changed some of the minor details as well as the name of the student athlete just to maintain confidentiality for both the individual and the university. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So the individual we're talking about, his name is Danny, and Danny is a collegiate freshman long jumper. Danny was a very high recruit coming out of high school. He has a very high degree of sports-specific technical competency. However, Danny does have a very low training age. And one of the things that Danny's been doing as a part of his first few months of his collegiate athletic career is participating in strength and conditioning. And this is important because Danny has dealt with some chronic injuries in the past, and he's found himself unable to consistently perform at the level that he wants to. So this is a big reason why we're in the weight room and we're trying to increase his proficiency with some of the movements in the weight room, because as of right now, where Danny stands, he has a relatively low physical fitness level and he needs to work on his general motor skill development. And ultimately, what we want to do is specifically make him better at some of the Olympic lifting variations, such as the snatch and the clean and jerk, which are going to help him perform over the long term in his collegiate track and field career. So let's talk about some of the roadblocks to Danny's expertise development. And we're going to talk about Danny's expertise development specifically within the context of physical expertise and all of the components that would fall under the physical pillar, if you will. So I want to make this distinction because performance in any sport is going to be heavily influenced by both not only technical ability, but also the physical and physiological capacity that the athlete is able to maintain throughout the course of their career. So some of the components that we're specifically targeting within Danny's physical expertise development are going to be characteristics such as bone density, coordination, and muscle composition. And like I mentioned earlier, we're specifically going to be using the Olympic lifts, which are the clean and the snatch in the weight room, to increase the characteristics that I mentioned. So let's talk a little bit more about where we want to be at the end of our intervention with Danny and how we're going to get there. So our goals by the time we're done working with Danny is we want to increase his proficiency in the Olympic lifts, being the clean and the snatch. We also want to improve his resiliency and physiological capacity. That way he can have a long and prosperous career. And we also want to increase his self-efficacy. As I mentioned, he's been dealing with some low self-efficacy issues that tend to be stemming from the weight room. And we want to change that. We want Danny to start experiencing some degree of success in the weight room and start building positive relationships with his peers in the weight room and his coaches in the weight room. That way that all of the positives will eventually bleed over into not only track and field, but the rest of his life. So how are we going to do that? We're mainly going to look at three different methods that we can manipulate within our interventions. And the first one is going to be motive instruction. Now, most of our instruction is going to be based off of the implicit instruction model that we talked about in this course. And that is quite simply because we're focused on long-term learning with Danny, and we want to be able to retain all of the skills that Danny is learning in the weight room. And implicit instruction is one of the most resilient forms of instruction when it comes to being able to maintain knowledge and maintain information and skill acquisition under pressure when it matters most, because we're not so concerned with being a weight room hero, but we want to be able to perform when it counts. And that's on competition day, that's on testing day, that's on the really big days in those high pressure environments. So that's why we're going to rely mostly on implicit instruction. But with that being said, Danny does have a very low training age. As I mentioned, he's only been training for a few weeks when he came into the Division I university that he started at. So we will have to rely on prescriptive instruction at some point throughout the process. Moving on to practice structure, one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about within the practice structure that we utilize with Danny is going to be the concept of contextual interference. And contextual interference is essentially, it's going to be the degree to which the complexity of the task that we're doing or the drill that we're doing is going to be able to perturb performance transiently in the acute sense. But long term, it's going to be able to provide context for different scenarios, and it's going to help Danny retain the lessons and the skills that he's learning throughout the practice sessions that we have. So contextual interference is going to be our main model that we're using in terms of practice structure. Moving on to information delivery and feedback. So with this, the main models that we're going to be using are going to be, it's an approach that's outlined by general and postponed feedback. What I mean by general is that we're not necessarily going to get into too many specifics with Danny. We're not going to be talking about specific joint angles and elbow positioning and what his feet should be doing, things like that. We're going to use more broad level cues and feedback mechanisms to help Danny understand what we're talking about when it comes to how to perform the clean and the snatch. We're also going to give Danny a little bit of time after each rep to be able to process what just happened, and even sometimes prompt him and ask him what happened, what he thinks happened, what he thinks he could do better. So we're going to be able to postpone our feedback that we give Danny a little bit because we don't want to overwhelm him. We want to be able to give him time to process everything that's going on. That way he can not only understand what's going on, but he could also reflect on what's going on and develop an action plan moving forward. And we're going to do all of this at a moderately high frequency because within our practice structure, we're going to be acquiring a lot of reps, and a lot of reps are going to be a lot of opportunities to learn and to ultimately get better at the skill. So before I get into the interventions that we use themselves, I just want to go over a quick definition that I read when I was looking at some of the research. And this definition is by Krakauer et al. It states that motor learning is a series of complex processes in the brain that occur in response to practice or experience of a specific skill, which results in change to the central nervous system that allow for production of a new motor skill. One thing I really like about that definition is that it talks about the central nervous system. And although I mentioned that we're focusing specifically on the physical components of expertise development, and people immediately start to focus on muscles and bones and things that you can immediately see on the outside, the central nervous system is still going to be the primary aspect that we're focusing on, because that's what's going to govern everything else in terms of physical prowess and physical competency within these Olympic lifting movements. So I do just want to stress that all of these adaptations are going to have to stem from the central nervous system in some way, specifically when we're talking about such technical lifts such as the snatch and the clean. Moving forward, as I mentioned, we are going to be utilizing both the implicit instruction model, and we're going to be moving Danny along the spectrum from novice to expert, hopefully being able to utilize a guided discovery approach. And I say this along with implicit instruction because, as I mentioned, these are going to be the models that are most resistant to what's called reinvestment. And that's going to be important as Danny progresses along his career, because we want him to be able to retain the skills that he's learning. And implicit instruction and guided discovery is going to be better at retaining that information as opposed to, say, explicit instruction or prescriptive instruction. And it's important that we try to work towards those while still being flexible in our approach, because we need to be flexible in our approach because Danny if we look at where he falls on the spectrum of expertise in regards to Olympic lifting, he would fall much closer to the novice spectrum. However, in the technical aspect of his sport, he falls a lot closer to the expert spectrum. So while he may not be that familiar with the specific skill of Olympic lifting, he does know how to be coached, and he knows a lot about demonstrations and how to communicate with his coaches. So he's been through that process before. So this is going to allow us to be a bit flexible in determining which models we want to use. For example, what we ended up doing with Danny is that a lot of times we would give him verbal cues, and a lot of these cues would be along the lines of using analogies, such as, I want you to move the bar with your hips moving so fast that you drive the bar up and make it float, right? We might not use the hips necessarily because that might be a little bit too technical for Danny, but we want to make the point that we're going to be using metaphors and analogies instead of specific joints or movements throughout our verbal instruction. And then for the demonstration aspect, we're going to be ideally using Danny's teammates that are proficient in the Olympic lifts and showing him, hey, look at your teammate, look at this person. You know what? Look at her. She just made a mistake. And now look at how she fixed that mistake. This is what you can do to fix your mistake that you're making on that snatch. So that's another way that we're going to be able to use demonstration with Danny. Moving on to practice structure. The practice structure that we decided to go with for our intervention is one that you can see on the right-hand screen. We're going to be choosing a practice structure that has high contextual interference and low practice variability. And as you can see, we are utilizing a high degree of contextual interference rather than a block practice approach, because we want to be able to work on distinct skills and distinct components of those skills on each trial. We are doing this because some of the research has shown that contextual interference has a more effective effect on learning due to the retainment that it causes of said motor skills and the specific context. So one thing that's good about contextual interference is that it's going to rid the athlete or free the athlete rather of being dependent on a very specific context that sometimes blocked practice will promote and expose the athletes to. So that's why we're deciding to go with a contextual interference approach, but we are keeping the practice variability relatively low because at the end of the day, we're still performing weightlifting movements and there's not a very high degree of variability or randomness, I should say, between reps or within the rep rather. Moving on to some of the microcycles themselves. So if you look up top at the left-hand corner, this is where Danny initially started at the beginning of the semester. If you look at Monday, he would perform a total of 6 sets of hang clean, and that would be one specific progression of an exercise. Then he'd move on to the clean pull, and then finally on Friday, he would perform the power clean. So this is a very general sort of typical strength and conditioning Olympic lifting progression. It's moving from one position to the next. Once you get good at that position, you can try another position. But the point is that there's very low contextual interference on each day. And this is a form of block practice on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Like I mentioned, this practice runs the risk of creating a contextual dependency that will eventually attenuate performance when the context of that performance is no longer the same and it's even altered, such as in a competition or a testing environment. However, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner where we see the contextual interference practice structure, we see that on each day, Danny is alternating between different forms of the Olympic lifting variation. So on the first set, he would perform a hang clean. On the second set, he did a clean pull. And on the third set, he did a power clean. And then he would repeat this would be on a Monday, right? And what that allows is that he's targeting different components of the skill on each of those different lifts. And then he's having to immediately move on to a different skill, and where the environment changes, but he still has to perform roughly the same task, which is going to be ideally what leads him to be able to retain the knowledge that he gains. And it's going to lead to greater long-term retention over time, which is going to be able to have him perform in the weight room for his entire collegiate career, rather than simply forgetting what we went over the week before, right? So that's the main reason why we decided to go with a contextual interference approach with Danny, where there is a potentially temporary decrease in performance at first, but long term, it's going to help with motor skill acquisition and long-term retention. Now let's talk about feedback. So feedback's a really important piece to Danny's learning process, especially in Olympic lifts. And some of the principles that we're deciding to go with is going to be starting with low precision. And I mentioned this when we talked about general feedback. And really what I mean by this is I mentioned that we're going to tell Danny to make the bar float. Now, what does that mean, make the bar float? Well, it probably just means whatever you think it means. If I told you to make the bar float, well, that would mean that you have to make the bar weightless. And in order to do that, you have to move the bar so fast that it generates so much momentum that all of a sudden it just wants to keep moving up, right? And if you do that, you're probably going to do a good job at performing that lift, and you're probably going to make that lift, and it's probably going to be right on par with what we're looking for. So rather than saying, Danny, I want you to bend your elbows to 90 degrees and I want you to squat the bar up and lift it over your head. No, that's too technical for Danny at this time. We don't want to overwhelm him with too much information. We're going to say 4 simple words. Those words are going to say, or are going to be, make the bar float. And from there, we're going to go ahead and let Danny figure out the best solution for this task. We're going to use a high frequency of several different models, that being descriptive, summary model, and bandwidth feedback models with Danny. Being that he is a relative novice in Olympic weightlifting, we feel that these models are going to fit him well, because on one end, closer to the descriptive end, we can make sure that we give Danny a lot of concise and targeted information, but at the same time, we can use the summary and the bandwidth feedback models to actively communicate with Danny and make sure that we're getting the point across within our coaching cues. And then lastly, our feedback is going to be postponed, because we want to make sure that we give Danny enough time after the reps that he performs to allow for processing, autonomous learning, and the preservation of attentional resources. So how do we do? I talked about all the different things that we did with Danny. Now it's time to see how he did from the time that he came in as a freshman in August towards the time that he left for Christmas break. So this graph essentially outlines Danny's progress that he made using the interventions that I've outlined in this presentation. And as you can see, in August, his power clean 1 rep max was around 95 pounds. That's what he came in at. And after about a month of working with some of these interventions and working in some of these techniques for technique development and motor skill acquisition, he skyrocketed up to 135 pounds. So he went from 95 pounds to 135 pounds in just 1 month, which is really, really good progress. And then from there, each month he tended to make steady increases, typically averaging about 10 pounds per month, which is still really, really good, especially on a lift that's as technical as the clean, right? So starting at August, he started at 95, and in December, before he left for break, he ended with a 175-pound power clean, totaling for an 80-pound increase in his 1 rep max. So that speaks to the effectiveness of some of these interventions, and it speaks to how long-term Danny's skills are being retained. You can see that this is over the scope of 5 months, and it's not just about 5 days or 5 hours even. And that's because we're using some of the interventions that promote learning retention and long-term motor skill acquisition. So this is going to be it for Danny's case study, and these are my references. If you have any questions, please feel free to respond to my Yellow Dig message board, and I look forward to speaking with you guys. Thank you.